Recovering Scotland's Slavery Past, the Caribbean Connection, a book which challenges us in Scotland in our belief that Scotland had no significant involvement in slavery. Can I now ask you to join me in welcoming Sir Tom Devine to the stage?
I was born in Jamaica, and I was born in St. Elizabeth. And St. Elizabeth was, in fact, the reception point 200 to 250 years ago for Scots arriving in Jamaica. In fact, in that area, I was very surprised to know that Robert Burns knew it very well, because he wrote about going to Savlamar, and that he was going across the island, and he was going to Port Antonio. So he knew more about Jamaica than I did.
Welcome to Fort's Camera Action. Behind me is an interesting statue of the immigrants' clearances, a time where local Highlanders were forced with oppression and tyranny to flee, seeking justice and peace beyond the shores of Scotland, which led to a mass exodus migration. Interestingly, Scots played a proud role in the abolition of slavery. What's hidden from most Scots is they also played a proud role in slavery. Many of Scottish industries, schools, churches, and universities were founded by the profits of the African slave trade. In 1796, Scotland owned nearly 30% of the estates in Jamaica, and by 1817, a staggering 32% of the slaves. For this study, we're going to be looking at Scotland and the slave trade. As always, provoking thought.
But the function of my trade is to try and understand the past, to try and investigate the past and understand why people behaved in the way they did, and taking into account the fact that until about the 1760s, 1770s, in the UK as a whole, there was hardly even a murmur, hardly any, even the smallest voice articulating opposition to what was at that time a conventional wisdom. That is, the way that the unfree regimes in the transatlantic colonies operated. That itself, of course, is a very intriguing historical question in its own right. Why that kind of set of assumptions survived for so long. Now, if we go to the Scottish dimension, we end up with a mixed picture. There has been much work done in Scottish historiography on aspects of the slave history, and particularly the history of the North American colonies and the Caribbean zone that I referred to earlier. But it's an imbalanced history. It's an imbalanced set of historiographies. The imbalance is so acute until very, very recently that it's therefore a distorted vision of the Scottish connection with this aspect of European and indeed world history.
Whether it was amnesia or, in fact, as just historians did not, in fact, felt confident enough to make this history known to the people of Scotland. In fact, all the lectures that I've given to the Scottish people since the revival of this history, since, say, 2007, the main comment that I've received from the Scottish people is, why has no one told us this before?
I think the Scots are known to be egalitarians, meaning that they are known to be fair. What has surprised many Scots, therefore, is how their ancestors behaved during slavery. Their history in slavery has been kept from them. I'm slave descent. My ancestors were slaves. I was born in Jamaica a long time ago, in 1940, and when I look at my own family, my mother is Lamond, my cousins are Moats, and my other cousins are Gladstone, and this is what has motivated me to look at the history. We're going to look at Scotland's role in slavery, not from a negative point of view, but trying to promote a relationship. If people know their history, it makes them even better people. And I'm sure the Scots would want to be that.
My name's Laura, and I'm going to tell you a little bit of why I see Glasgow differently to the majority of people who live here. When you walk around, whether it's go to dinner, go to work, go shopping, you see street names, you see statues, but what you don't realise is that they're named after the men who own plantations in Jamaica and America. So we're just about to turn onto Glassford Street, named after John Glassford, who was a plantation owner in Maryland and Virginia.
My name is Professor Jeff Palmer, and I'm standing in St Andrew Square in Edinburgh. We're here today to discuss Henry Dundas, the first Viscount Melville, and his statue is right behind me, and in fact I'm told it's 150 feet high. Now, one may be considering why anyone has got a statue so high in the middle of Edinburgh. In fact, people ask me that all the time. I can't give them an answer, but what I can tell you is something about his life. We'll be examining Scotland's true relationship with slavery.
They're putting money into industry, they're putting money into banks.
The positive role that Scotland played in the abolition of slavery.
I think it's a bit of Glasgow's history which, it doesn't appreciate enough.
And we'll also be looking into the life of one of the key black abolitionists, James McCoon Smith.
I really am extraordinarily proud. I'm his great-granddaughter.
Henry Dundas was a powerful politician. He was Lord Advocate, in charge of war, he was in charge of the Navy, he was in charge of the Board of Control, he in fact was Keeper of the Signet, he was Governor of the Bank of Scotland. That's how powerful he was. However, although known for these roles, one of his other great acts for which he is remembered is that he was very interested in slavery. And his interest in slavery was that he regarded it as important for the stability and the economic benefits of Great Britain. He defended that position by stopping William Wilberforce from abolishing the slave trade for 15 years. He did it in the House of Commons, and he did it by negating the value of abolition. And he did it by putting into the act one powerful word, and that powerful word was that slavery should be gradually abolished. And in order for Wilberforce to get the act through to abolish the slave trade, he had to accept Dundas's word of gradual abolition. Well, I've known Stephen Mullen for quite a long time. I knew when he finished his first degree and was thinking of what next to do. He had a genuine interest in this history, to attempt to tell this story, to study it and tell it.
Glasgow's colonial history has become synonymous with the tobacco lords. They have passed into the popular mythology. The city is resplendent in their scarlet cloaks, gold-tipped canes. But these guys are certainly, major figures in the development of Glasgow.
When people think of the merchant city today, they think of coffee shops, nice pubs, restaurants. It's a nice cool quarter of the city. But my job is uncovering what these merchants actually did. Who were these merchants? How did this come to be? 10 years ago, I started research in this area, and it eventually was published in a little book called It Wasn't Us. Almost immediately I started giving tours of historic Glasgow, essentially tours revealing Glasgow's connections with New World slavery. There are many areas today in the merchant city that have a distinctly colonial flavour. This is us standing in front of St Andrews in the square, and for a short period this would have been the most fashionable place for these merchants to live before they eventually moved westwards. As you can see, it's a fantastic example of mercantile extravagance. They've got the connections to import the Spanish mahogany, and they have the masons, Mungo Naismith and others who are making sure that this place is one of the most fantastic churches in Scotland. So these tobacco lords, the town council, dominated by these merchants at the time, they're very much making a statement about the development of the city. 1740 till 1790, this is known as Glasgow's golden age of tobacco. More tobacco is imported at Clyde ports than all the other English ports put together. So if you can imagine that tobacco really dominates the global economy at the time, and the Glasgow merchants are at the top of that, you're seeing Glasgow really is at the centre of the world. So Glasgow undergoes rapid phases of development whilst dependent on the slave economies. The fantastic churches, the fantastic townhouses, they're putting money into industry, they're putting money into banks. These guys are behind the development of modern Glasgow. Glasgow's motto is, of course, let Glasgow flourish. But I don't think it's too controversial to say that New World slavery helped Glasgow flourish. But then the West India merchants, they call themselves the sugar aristocracy.
Right.
New money. So just like the tobacco lords, they have a self-appointed title with delusions of grandeur. The tobacco lords, the sugar aristocracy.
And the distortion is because most of the material we have and the analysis that has come down to us, until I would say around about the year 2001, 2002, 2003, has focused virtually exclusively on the Scottish role in abolitionism. The Scottish role in abolitionism. And in fact, the Scottish record in abolitionism is a record of which this nation should be truly proud. With 10% of the British population circa 1800, normally in every year about a third of the anti-slavery petitions emanating from the UK came from Scotland. And at the same time, we spawned several of the leading figures, many of them singularly charismatic figures, second only to William Wilberforce in the campaign against the so-called nefarious trade.
The debate at the present time has surfaced about this statue behind me for two reasons. One, it's the Charlottesville protest. Also, there is a plaque to Henry Dundas, and the plaque doesn't really give justice to the life that he led and the act that he carried out. If we do not have a description of what people like Henry Dundas did, what you will have is the present Viscount Melville actually stated that his ancestor was actually an abolitionist. When I saw that, I was not only disturbed by it, I was annoyed by it, because it's just nonsense. In fact, it's insulting. It's insulting to abolitionists like Wilberforce, and it's also insulting to history, because this is a man who actually stopped the abolition of the slave trade for 15 years. Why I think the present Viscount is proposing that, and I say it's a proposal because it's not based on fact. In 1778, we had a case in Scotland where a slave master brought back one of his slaves with him from Jamaica. The slave ran away, and the slave master, of course wanting his slave back, took the matter to court. And the right of the slave to be free in Scotland was defended by distinguished individuals such as Boswell, of Johnson and Boswell. The name of the slave was Joseph Knight. What the Scottish courts ruled was that the slave should be free in Scotland. Dundas was Lord Advocate at the time, and the ruling was based on the following: the law that since there was no slavery in Scotland, you could not have a slave. Also, it's based on the rights of individuals in Scotland at the time, that if you did not tell someone that you want to be a slave or their slave, they couldn't enslave you. And that was how Joseph Knight was freed. Now, there's a precedent to this case in England, and that was in 1772, where Lord Mansfield freed the slave Somerset, and he freed him on the same basis. So all Henry Dundas and the Scottish judges were doing was to confirm a judgment which had previously occurred in England. Now, I cannot see how that makes Henry Dundas, the first Lord Melville, an abolitionist.
We're now in Glasgow Cathedral, sometimes known as the High Kirk. This is the medieval heart of Glasgow, and perhaps the most sacred place in the city today. So I'm standing on the burial tomb of Richard and Alexander Oswald, as you can see here. This is in between the 8th and 9th nave. They're the only mercantile family to be afforded this privilege to be buried in Glasgow Cathedral. This is the most sacred heart of the city, where it's only where your most prominent dignitaries and politicians of the day would have been buried. So this was a very rare honour for two merchants to be buried here. It's perhaps ironic that these two merchants, perhaps slave traders, are buried in the sacred heart of the city. They were a real mercantile dynasty in Glasgow, and Richard Oswald is one of the leading authorities on the slave trade in Glasgow in the 1720s. The Oswalds also have another link to perhaps the most infamous of all Scottish slave traders. Richard Oswald of Auchencrew is a nephew of the two uncles buried here.
We're standing in front of Oswald Hall in Ayrshire, and this is a very important house historically.
We acquired this from the Agricultural College just over 4 years ago.
I can see you've got Richard Oswald on the right.
Yes.
This house is his. He bought it in about 1764. He died in this house, and his wife died here too. You can imagine them coming down that wrought iron staircase out in this garden in the summer's days like today. I think the irony and the contrast is we're standing in this magnificent building and we're looking out on this magnificent sort of garden where they probably had parties, and at the same time people were being beaten to death in the Caribbean. Richard Oswald went to Jamaica and bought an island just outside Sierra Leone called Bant's Island. And from that island, the Oswald bought and sold slaves, you know, as if it were like a supermarket.
The Scots constructed a golf course on Bant's Island. They dressed the enslaved people on the island in tartan that had been imported from Bannockburn and from Glasgow, and they used these enslaved people as caddies in the golf course.
The wood on top of that door is pine wood from Jamaica, actually carved into local Scottish pine. So in a way, symbolically, it's sort of bringing the past and the present together. I think it's very important, the work that you've done to restore it and to even get back some of the paintings which were taken to America, because this house reflects not only Scottish history, it is British history, it is American history, it is Jamaican history, it's African history. A wee boy from Glasgow, looking at this house, one may say he did very well, but he did it buying and selling people.
I think what it does say is that if you have what we call honest history, it tends to have a greater impact.
Yeah.
So when I go about Scotland giving, talks on the Scottish Caribbean connections, as I call them, the main reaction is, why hasn't anybody told us this before?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think this is I think it's been a collective failure for historians of this. I mean, this really is a golden age, because this has been almost an unknown history up to, I would say, maybe the last 20 years. Right. What you're seeing now is a real new understanding and a new generation of scholars that are working on this.
Well, I'm in the Glasgow City Archives, which is located in the Mitchell Library in Glasgow. And we are here today to look up some of the archival material. Marinka Thompson-Odlum is the PhD student. So Marinka, you're doing a PhD, or you've done it?
I'm still in the process of doing it.
You're still in the process of doing it.
The subject fascinates me, being that I grew up in the West Indies, and sometimes, there's a place in St. Lucia called Glasgow, but never really thought about twice, like why it was called Glasgow. And my PhD is a joint venture between the University of Glasgow and Glasgow Museums. And so all these fabulous documents at the Glasgow City Archives really helped me kind of create a picture. You can see the number of ships that leave the various colonies in the West Indies and the amount of hogsheads. Just think of it as a barrel of sugar. So here you see in Jamaica, 19 ships leave and roughly 5,700 hogsheads of sugar is brought in. So, I mean, this is a huge endeavour.
So it was contributing to the economy of Glasgow.
Yes.
And to the so-called social and
because we have more people, we have more merchants moving here, setting up their businesses. So here we have a indenture, a mortgage between Robert and Archibald Sterling.
Okay.
And so it's for properties in Jamaica, but these slaves are also included.
So the property is mortgaged?
Yes.
And the mortgage includes the slaves as part of it, fair enough, because the slaves are the price.
Yeah, and they're also, they are property. So that's why you have them all included. So you have, it says here, cattle, stock, slaves.
What these documents do show is it is what we call now direct evidence. This is a history which is very much alive because I'm a descendant of slaves, and so is Marinka. And therefore it is fascinating that is the descendants of slaves who are doing this research. And I'm hoping that when our PhD is completed, it will be available, because I think it would be really a fascinating piece of work, and the people of Glasgow will benefit.
I just think it's important to know where not only you come from, but where your country comes from, where the ideology and ideas that build up a nation come from. And I think if you understand all these ideas, then you have a much better future.
Coming up in part 2, we switch our attention to the country's key role in abolition, and we will tell the remarkable story of James McCune Smith.
I think it's a bit of Glasgow's history which doesn't appreciate enough.
One important aspect of this history is that those two ex-slaves were freed in Scotland and England, but if they were in Jamaica, and if their masters had taken them back to Jamaica, they would officially be slaves. Now, when one considers the impact of that is still with us, because it is the essence of the argument at Charlottesville. It is the essence of the argument of rights in London, or in Africa and in other parts of the world, because from that slavery has come a lot of the negative images that we have of people who were slaves against their will. And somehow we do need to speak honestly about this history, because if we do that, I think it would give the descendants of slaves a better sense of belonging. A sense of belonging which says this is part of their history, but it's not an inglorious part of their history. It is a part of their history which, in fact, they want other people to acknowledge. And to also recognize that during the slavery, the slaves rebelled, they protested, and they weren't passive. The fact is they're up against greater forces, and that was the best they can do.
From the writings of a former boss of mine, the Vice-Chancellor at Aberdeen University in his earlier days, Duncan Rice, that the philosophes of the Scottish Enlightenment were at the very heart of the project demonstrating the immorality of this process, that these individuals who were enslaved were human beings, not commodities, and that every human being had a duty of benevolence to every other. And even Professor Adam Smith, from the chair of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow, illustrated quite convincingly that not only was this nefarious, not only was this a wickedness, but it was also stupid in economic terms, because as he acidly demonstrated, free labour in the long run was actually less costly than slave labour in terms of opportunity costs.
Somehow we have a sort of a continuation in the slave business from early 1700s with tobacco and the late 1700s with sugar.
But on the other side, I mean, Glasgow has a really proud and radical tradition of abolition as well, right? We're sitting in the McEwen Smith Cafe.
I went on the slave walk, I think in 2013, so I came up with the name for McEwen Smith a year later. People would come in and say to me when they sort of read up about James McEwen Smith, because we've got a bit on the back of the menu explaining who he was, that they would be feeling really embarrassed that they didn't know who he was. But then, you know, neither did I. I mean, he embodies both all that is good and all that is bad about Scottish history.
James McEwen Smith is significant because he's the first African-American to receive a medical degree. He was born a slave in America. His mother had been a slave in South Carolina. He comes from New York. He is eventually free when New York City ends slavery in the 1820s.
And he went to school and he was head of his class. When he applied to like Columbia University or a university in the USA, they wouldn't take him because he was black. Because he had been such a social person, putting himself out to make a difference with other people, which was unusual for a kid that age at that time. All these important people got together and sent him to Scotland.
He came to Glasgow because he could get a degree here, and he found he was a brilliant student. He was fluent in at least 3 or 4 languages, including ancient Greek and Latin. He's really important as a medical innovator. He opens a pharmacy. He's the first practicing physician. He's the doctor for the coloured orphan asylum. He's very well known and a really important abolitionist. He's the first secretary of the Radical Abolitionist political party. Chairs their convention. The next time a black man would chair a national political party convention will be 125 years later. So he's very important, but I think he's forgotten for a number of reasons.
I really am extraordinarily proud to be his, what am I? I'm his great-granddaughter.
He's part white. His wife is part white. His children are even more white. Within 2 generations, they pass as white. They don't remember, either don't want to, or after a while don't even know of their black ancestry. It's not until his great-great-great-granddaughter in the early 2000s does some genealogy that she realizes, 1, she has a black ancestor, 2, it's a very famous abolitionist.
I don't know why I should care about being part of history, but I do. I knew we had a family Bible. It was huge. But there were pages in the middle that were all about us. I could recognize the names of my parents, then of my grandparents, then of my cousins, then even going further back to the 1700s in the Bible about my family. And that we could recognize who we were from. I'm trying to remember how it came that we discovered this. Oh, here we are. Okay, weddings, James McEwen Smith and Malvina Barnett.
In 2003, I was at my grandmother's house in Connecticut, and we were looking at the family Bible, and I noticed the name James McCune Smith, which sounded familiar to me. I did some research over the next couple of months and found that he actually was my ancestor.
I think that people think I'm odd because I am as old as I am. 98? Am I 98? Yeah. I wonder why I am as old as I am. And part of, I have the sense that there's more to be done in the world. Therefore, I honor those who speak out for what they believe in, no matter how convenient. And I love it that it's in our family. And I love it that we are a mixture.
I think it's a bit of Glasgow's history which, you know, doesn't appreciate enough that, you know, while all the slavery was going on, there's this sort of, you know, glimmer in the history
of hope.
I actually follow them on Facebook, the James McCune Smith Cafe, and I hope to go there someday when I'm in Scotland.
Okay, the first thing is this, and this in a sense was to give support almost to those, if you like, the deniers. We now know that between the later 17th century and the 1760s, only about 4,300 slaves were actually transported from Africa by ships sailing directly from Scottish ports. 27, perhaps 30 voyages in all, maybe in the future slightly increased, but that's a drop, horrible phrase to use, a drop in the ocean compared to the 3.2 million. And that absence of a direct slaving connection gave an historical basis, in my view, to much of the amnesia and also to much of the denial, which underpinned this subject area for so long. But what happened was this. This lack of direct connection was nothing to do with moral scruple. As Price pointed out as long ago as 1964, the reasons why the Glaswegians did not participate to any extent in direct slave trading was because Liverpool, Bristol and to a significant extent London were already entrenched within it. And to cut a very long story short, if you study the history of Scottish traders in Europe, they always went for the soft underbelly. One of their vade mecum was always to avoid areas of intense competition and go to areas which were opening up, which were relatively virgin territory.
Now, when I look at the plaque, it says at the end he was impeached. He was indeed impeached. He was impeached because here was a man who was traitor of the Navy. He was in charge of war. And the Navy was the most important institution at the time. Dundas had transferred money from the Navy to his own account. Samuel Whitbreads took out impeachment proceedings against him, and in fact, Dundas, chose to be tried by his peers in the House of Lords. And of course, they acquitted him. However, in 1806, the impeachment process and the scandal that related to it caused Dundas to resign. So technically, he's the last person to be impeached in the House of Commons. Now, it says he was impeached, but it didn't say why. And I think somehow the public should be aware because they've asked. And again, that's the nature of the man. In 1793, Robert Burns wrote Scots for Hay, and he was aware that he had to do various things to avoid the wrath of Henry Dundas. So somehow this man has not only affected the lives and the freedom of slaves, but he also affected the lives of people in Scotland. If you ask me to summarize that, I would say he had one powerful hand that took from the poor and gave to the rich, and the other, another powerful hand that took from slaves and gave it to slavers.
We know that in London, by about 1770, 1780, something like 15 to 20% of those merchants active in the slave business were first-generation Scots. We also know from the recent work, marvellous work in fact, published by the University College London team, recently described on the TV, on compensation data, when owners of slaves were compensated for their, quote, property after 1833, when the slave system was abolished. We also know from those data that of the 10 biggest syndicates by that stage, that is the early 1830s, it's a kind of snapshot, the 10 biggest syndicates, 3 to 4 of them were either run by Scottish merchants or were originally founded by traders from north of the border, traders from this country.
One of the things that fascinates me is during the Enlightenment, you have these philosophers, you have just generally good people in the church coming together. But if you look at the political side, you have Scottish MPs who, when an abolition vote came up, they just absented themselves. We're standing in the archive of the Heriot-Watt University, and as you can see, these are records of the past as far as the Heriot-Watt is concerned. This is a letter written by the MP for this area in 1838, and he's writing to his father. The abolition of the apprenticeship was carried last night by a majority of 3. The numbers were 96 to 93. He then goes on to point out that the majority of Scottish MPs didn't turn up. Only 14 turned up. Only 4 voted for abolition, and he was one of them. I voted with the majority and would do so again. This letter, we've got to balance that against the vote numbers. So it tells you that most Scottish MPs feel the public and business and the whole commerce of Scotland was very important, more important than abolition. In this sense, the minority of Scottish people who managed our society was voting for business rather than the lives of people 5,000 miles away. But, you know, nevertheless, you can't really disregard that there were people like Gibson Craig, and I feel proud of it because I'm associated with a Heriot-Watt. I think the passion and the morality of his actions tells you something about the man. And here is a descendant of slaves finding this letter. I've become a professor here, and I've got other awards from all over the world, but I think finding this letter, I think, is probably the most significant.
So this is the vote to end the apprenticeship scheme in 1838.
Yeah, to abolish slavery altogether.
So the apprenticeship scheme had originally was supposed to go for an extended period, but this is the actual vote to end it early after 4 years.
That's right. We've had abolition, and we've had both in 1838 British slavery and American slavery in 1865. And what do we have now? And I think the work historians and a program like this may be doing about, you know, trying to elucidate and to inform and to raise awareness, I think is extremely important.
So you think in the last 10 years then there has been a growing awareness about the role of Scots in Jamaica?
Yes.
Do you think there's been a change?
Very much so, and I think for the better. Many of our prejudices of today come from the cruelties and mistakes of the past. If we can learn from the past, we can produce a better future.
So some may argue that it was a different time, and yes, it was, but should they have their names immortalised in the street names and the places that they built with slave money? I'm not saying take down street names, I'm not saying tear down the buildings, I'm just saying that the slaves' names should be up there with them.
Petitions have been put into the council about the plaque and what it says. Now, I support this petition, and I think it's very gracious and courageous of the council to say they will consider it again in order to arrive at a more accurate historical description of what Henry Dundas represented.
I've not received a lot of animosity. What I've received is a lot of, in fact, disappointment and surprise at the education that they've received. And although people talk about, I think David Cameron said something like, let's move on. The problem is we don't move on from celebrating Burns or Trafalgar or Walter Scott or the war. But somehow we must move on from this. And this to me is completely biased and unfair. And nobody really accepts it. If we look at the history, just very quickly, we're standing, no matter where you stand in Scotland, you're not more than walking distance away from this history. So the Gallery of Modern Art is the slave master's house. The necropolis was built by James Ewing, whom the estate, the Caymanas estate, is still in Jamaica. In fact, the family still owns it. So we have a history that is all around us. And what I would like to say is that I'm very pleased that David Potts has actually picked up this baton, and as without him we wouldn't be here today putting forward this petition. He's done a lot of hard work, and I'd like to thank and congratulate him for all that hard work. It's the one individual who sometimes can drive things rather than a group of people. So we from Jamaica thank him very much for publicising this history.
Thank you for watching Thoughts Camera Action. Before you go anywhere, don't forget to click subscribe.